Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We would like to continue the day's events. For those that were with us yesterday, I did mention that we had two academics on the programme this weekend. The first of which was Dr. Susan Blackmore, who presented an interesting talk yesterday called Close Encounters with Death. Susan Blackmore is a doctor of psychology. To give a kind of an opposing viewpoint, if you like, we have our next speaker, and that is Dr. John Shaw, also of the psychological profession. He has a very long CV, so I won't embarrass him too much, but up until not too long ago, Dr. Shaw was the head of the psychology department at the University of Manchester Institute of Science and Technology. That's a real mouthful. UMIST. He now is a consultant in psychology, and we have a presentation entitled UFO Contactees, Victims or Equals. Thank you very much, Dr. John Shaw.
Well, my former colleagues will be surprised to hear that I was their head, but certainly I was up there amongst them anyway. But it's a pleasure to be with you today to share your deliberations. And as a psychologist, I'm interested in the people more than the technology of the UFO phenomenon. I did say last year when I was invited to come along that in many ways the psychologist is ill-fitted to deal with this phenomenon because he hasn't got the concepts. He's lacking in many of the concepts, or if you like, paradigms, which are essential for understanding this phenomenon. He has a very limited concept of what the human being is, and his spiritual power. He works in general on a lower level of personality. However, today I will try to stick to mainstream psychological ideas to see what we can make of the unfortunate or fortunate individuals who have a UFO experience. Now, a psychologist, or psychology generally, is interested in people's dreams, fantasies, UFO contacts, near-death experiences. Many of these things can be and are very significant. In fact, vital sometimes to individuals' survival and comprehension. The psychologist does not get into a philosophical debate about degrees of reality. It is sufficient that the individual remembers something or has a story to tell and wants to tell that story to somebody. And this is the spirit in which I approach these experiences. And when I use the words shock, or trauma, or stress, or victim, I'm not putting any special technical meaning on these terms. But if you can think of great distress, I think that would suffice to understand what I'm driving at. Now, in a book published in 1956 called When Prophecy Fails, 3 social psychologists from America studied a group in the Southwest who had received channeled messages about the impending end of the age. They were promised evacuation by means of a UFO hours before the cataclysm would hit the locality, and various other instructions as to their survival. Unfortunately, or fortunately, the UFO did not arrive, nor did the cataclysm. And they were left in various states of disarray even though some as a consequence did not give up their beliefs, but in fact reinforced them in various ways. The psychologists who were investigating them were interested in the psychological processes by which the members of the group would cope with their disconfirmation. Being psychologists, they knew it wouldn't happen. It was obviously not going to happen. We take that as read. They think it's going to happen. We are psychologists, we know it's not going to happen. Let's see how they cope with that. So they infiltrated themselves into the group in a way that I don't think would be permitted now. I mean, ethically permissible. They were concerned with not with the essential truth or falsehood, because they knew, they were intellectuals, they knew that these beliefs were false. They had to be false. Of course the earth is not going to end here, it's not going to end tomorrow. We sensible, educated people know that. Let's see how they cope with the reality of it not happening. For us, however, there's a deeper significance, because it underlines the vulnerability of all contactees, all abductees, whether voluntary or involuntary, whether they're organized into groups of believers or not. There's always the possibility of letdown, humiliation, loss of esteem from their peers, as well as the sheer outlandishness of the experiences themselves, encapsulated in the many mythical stories of little green men. All of this contributes to the reluctance of many contactees and abductees to disclose even those parts of their experiences that they can recall. We had an example of this last night, and Ken will bear me out on this. The young lady in Paisley Close refused to tell us about one of her experiences. That's so, isn't it? What did she say? I cannot tell anybody about this. Certainly not while there was a group of people around. Whether if Ken went back later, she would speak, I don't know. I doubt it somehow. You know, that's a kind of a common reaction, isn't it? The fact that some professional writers have made capital out of their own abductions doesn't alter my point. They, if you like, they are professional victims. They make their living out of bearing their souls to other people. But in the main, for the ordinary person, it's a very mixed blessing to encounter a UFO, as it is for other types of experience. In the real-life group about which Festinger's book was written, the observers masqueraded as believers in order to get first-hand information. I think this is very dubious psychological practice. But they did, and at one point, ludicrously, there were 15 of the believers in a room, 5 of whom were psychologists or their supporters. And these 5 were watching the other 10. They didn't realise that the 10 were watching them as well, saying, who are these people? Why don't they really say what they think? Why are they being so cagey? So the debate continues about whether UFO experiences are benign or harmful so far as the human race is concerned. These issues of vulnerability are extremely important. In fact, especially if we take some of the views that Clive Potter is associated with, namely that the UFO abductee can think of himself or herself as a pawn between warring cosmic factions. And they can be sacrificed for the greater good of the mission, which is out of their hands. So I want to try to show in this paper that all those contacted or abducted are potential victims. Arguably, you could say this is no big deal, since if you're alive, you're a potential victim. Anything can happen to you. All human beings are potential victims by the mere fact of being alive. But on the plus side, for the UFO contactees or abductees, the process of being contacted or abducted often seems, I emphasize seems, to involve built-in safeguards to protect the individuals if they are alert to them. Now, one form of safeguard, which has been noted, but not always regarded as a safeguard, sometimes regarded as harmful, are the so-called men in black, or the space visitors. In the group which Festinger studied, the central figure in the contact group received a visit from spacemen shortly after a newspaper story of the group's preparation for evacuation appeared. Spread all over the papers down in Utah. And then the spaceman appeared and knocked on the door and asked for an interview. She didn't know them. During the visit lasting half an hour, the visitors made it clear that the channeler was, quote, not to publish or publicise their message any further. Instead, she was to seal the books in her possession and wait for further orders, which presumably would come from outer space. That's my addition. No further authority for this command was given other than that, quote, the time is not right now. And having conveyed their message, the two men left. Now this is, the psychological researchers didn't pick up on this. They reported it, but saw nothing significant in it. In any case, they didn't believe in anything that was going on, other than the fact that these were people going through in a potentially stressful situation. But if that message had been heeded, they could have pulled the plug and rationalised this in some way, and suffered less humiliation. This is not the first time that a dry run has been planned by the, quote, Space Brothers. In a famous case in Denmark in the 1960s, where a group was informed that they should build a nuclear fallout shelter because there would be a nuclear holocaust on the 24th of December of that year. On the 22nd of December, they were told to lock the shelter and go away. Yet another dry run. No, that was the let out. That was the way of avoiding the humiliation of standing there and nothing happens when it's supposed to. Let me talk a little bit more then about victims and potential victims in UFO abduction and contact. Now, there's little doubt that the evidence suggests that there's a high incidence of psychological stress or physical suffering among those who have encountered UFOs. I mean, I'm leaving it open what is meant by that term. It's psychologically significant. What it means physically, we don't know. Even those pilots who have had a visual close encounter with nothing more ensuing admit to profound shock. Incidentally, the shock appears to be mutual, does it not? How many times do we read of the aliens running back inside the spacecraft when they are spotted? However, the stress level increases greatly among those who claim to have been abducted rather than simply have visual contact. You will recall that the Hill couple's desire to explore their abduction experience was triggered by the high incidence of stress symptoms suffered in the post-abduction period. And then, of course, we have the most disturbing aspect of all, the assertion by Hopkins in his book Intruders that most of the abductees whom he counselled were first contacted during childhood, then having been tagged, it was that much easier for them to be utilised in later life. And of course the fact that amnesia surrounds most of these contacts enhances the victim status of the persons concerned. Now we hear a lot about amnesia in abduction victims, missing time and so on. And it seems to be assumed, as far as I can see from the literature, that amnesia, the amnesia that the contactees suffer, has been imposed upon them by the aliens, who've instructed them to forget what they have experienced. However, can I, as a psychologist, pedantically point out that when Freud used this term, defined amnesia, his sense of it is quite different. Amnesia, classically speaking, is a form of psychological self-defense. It's something initiated from within, from the subconscious or the ego. It's a way of preventing some totally unacceptable fact from occupying center stage of one's awareness. It's a defense mechanism, and a pretty powerful one, if you've ever come across people who have held an incident in repression for over 30 or 40 or 50 years. And you remember, those of you who are up in the literature, that Velikovsky used this concept to great effect in his classic Worlds in Collision. Man doesn't believe that he came out of cataclysm because he doesn't want to remember the fact that he did. It was erased from the race memory, not by an alien or by a loving God, but by the sheer force of the ego, individually and collectively. In short, it is the traumatized person who uses the amnesiac defense to prevent the full horror of the experience from preoccupying them. This is not just true of UFOs. And the mechanism may also involve other neurotic behavior to channel off the repressed energy that keeps breaking through despite the amnesiac defense. Energy and anxiety will still break through and therefore will often give rise to obsessional symptoms or anxiety symptoms of various kinds. So, many UFO abductees may simply not be known as such at all, because their amnesia, their self-defense mechanisms are so effective that nothing untoward is even remembered except an uneasy feeling. They may simply be numbered amongst the thousands who apparently out of the blue develop a neurosis, or in some cases a psychosis, in which overtly anyway UFOs play no part whatsoever. So I think we have to be careful as to our assumptions about the role of amnesia. And I think I've said enough to indicate that it is a potentially traumatic experience, especially when given what we are led to believe from some literature, the inordinate interest of the aliens in the reproductive processes of the abductees and the reproductive experiments which reached their culmination in the incident which we were discussing in the bar last night, in which Kathy Davis is confronted with her brood of 9 half-alien children, all presumably created out of her genetic material, but without her consent at all. In this case, she has to be a victim par excellence. Either that or she's deeply paranoid, which is in itself a victim category. So even the most mature and socially adjusted individuals who report abduction experiences, for example, Strieber, report terrifying feelings of loss of control in the presence of these entities. And Stanford, 1978, reports the case of Lonnie Zamora, the New Mexican policeman who had a close encounter with a landed UFO. And Stanford says of him, quote, "He was bewildered, practically to a point of shock. Somewhere in the back of his mind he must have been saying that it all just could not have happened, it just could not be real." And suffered consequent stress symptoms such as loss of sleep and so on. We are given no evidence of the long-term effects. Incidentally, in the case of Zamora, you might ask, why did the amnesiac defense not come into play? I think he would have liked nothing better than amnesia for the whole thing. But his ego, or his subconscious, if you will, was unable to use that ploy because of the context in which the encounter occurred. It was broad daylight. He was on duty. There was confirmatory evidence from colleagues, not to mention photographic evidence and so on. I mean, the ego is not a complete unrealist, if you like. It can only work in certain situations with its device of amnesia. To the list of psychological victims must also be added the names of those who are thought to be victims of the authorities because of their inordinate interest in UFOs. People such as Edwards and Jessup, to name but two. Although in these cases, for someone like me working only from the literature, the evidence is sparse and we're in the realm of speculation rather than fact, but the circumstantial evidence is suggestive of the deliberate removal of these individuals. And various theories exist. Although, as I said before, there's often let-outs, escape routes. After all, Jessup was warned in the many letters he had from this mystery figure C.M. Allende. And so, I think the case for potential victims can be made out. Whatever Kathy Davis and others may have suffered, at least they're still alive. Jessup and Edwards paid a greater price for their persistence, and one could cite other examples. Turning now to the other side of the coin, is one a victim, or is one necessarily a victim, or can one be an equal? Can one be the equal of these people, or take them on, or encounter them person to person? We have to turn to a consideration of those who can cope. Not that everybody thinks the odds are good. Tansley, for example, says that given the nature of the modern mass psyche, very few people have the capacity to enter into the experience of UFO contact or abduction and emerge unscathed. So the warning would seem to be, have nothing to do with it. Go to your local fundamentalist church and get protection or whatever the method may be. There are, anyway, contactees and abductees who lose their terror of the close encounter or have solely positive emotions about their experiences with aliens. Now, you'll be familiar with some of these people. Edward Meyer, in the book that Kinder wrote, the Diane of them all, George Adamski. In these cases, if their accounts are to be believed, terror is replaced by cooperation, even if there's a great deal of mystification about many aspects of the aliens' appearances, disappearances, modes of travel, and short-term and long-term objectives so far as humanity is concerned. And the mood which pervades an equal as distinct from a victim relationship is struck right at the start of Adamski's account. And this is the second book now, not the first one. And he says, quote, "As I acknowledged the greeting, the speaker extended his hand, and when it touched mine, a great joy filled me. The signal was the same as had been given me by the man I had met in the desert. Consequently, I knew these men were not inhabitants of Earth. Nevertheless, I felt entirely at ease as we shook hands, and the younger man said, 'We were to meet you. Have you time to come with us?'" There's a great deal of difference between this kind of contact and the situation described by Hopkins, where he says an individual, male or female, is abducted as a child, possibly as early as the 3rd year, etc., etc. There's no possibility of these relationships being equal. They're at the best, parent-child relationships or adult-child relationships. And yet we do have some accounts on the positive side. And one can quote a number of them. Perhaps Faye Clark, who says, after a UFO contact, we only had the most wonderful feeling of peace and harmony and the knowledge that we were witnessing the beauty of the ultimate of creation. The closer we came to the object, the more we were suffused with a feeling of reverence, beauty, and humility. Nevertheless, the panic reaction is regarded as standard. And researchers often express surprise and incredulity at a witness who remains relaxed. There's a lovely one in the UFO Times, I don't know whether the author's present or not, and UFO Times number 21, page 17, it says, when the witness opened her window and invited the beings to come inside, the translator says, quote, normal behavioural conditions were suspended, unquote. What was the normal behaviour we were expecting there? To tell them to get lost? Normal behavioural conditions were suspended. Absolutely. Another contactee who, far from being a victim, well, unless you exclude the media, a victim of the media, is Uri Geller. He asserts that he has derived his psychokinetic and telepathic powers from his contact with UFOs over the years. He admits to the fact of cooperating with his extraterrestrial controllers. He says, quote, they control my feelings, they put us through heavy tests all the time. I suppose you're all being tested, I guess we have to be purified. And despite the skeptical questioning of Geller by researchers, nothing can shake his belief that the source of his powers is a being called Hoover. So it's worthwhile pointing out that trauma or stress or shock is not the inevitable consequence of an encounter, of an abduction or a close contact, although that may be the case initially. Michel, revisiting the lavender farmer in Provence, Michamas, I put the spelling there, 2 years after his close contact with small grey-green men, said of him, quote, we were all struck by his serenity, a man in whom there dwells a certainty. People would say, well, at what price has he bought that certainty? What does he have to sacrifice to gain that certainty? Nevertheless, he certainly is not in shock. Turning to a few psychological considerations. What, from a psychologist's perspective, seems to be important in terms of whether an individual can weather the storm of a UFO abduction or contact? What would seem to be the psychological prerequisites? Well, I think the first concept, I said I would stick to mainstream psychological concepts. I think the first one is conditioning. We're all the products of conditioning. We are socialized through childhood, and we become identified with, some would say over-identified with, physical reality. This is it. Three-dimensional reality. That's all there is. So you better believe it. We do. And physics, which is the scientific study of the physical world, nothing else, combines with our experience to define the nature of what we accept as reality. Therefore, any experience which falls outside the parameters of this conditioning will be perceived as strange, unreal, shocking, frightening, horrifying. Whether it be a telepathic communication, a near-death experience, a state of dissociation, a nightmare, a UFO contact, an anxiety state, or whatever. We have an inbuilt prejudice to keep things normal. Let's keep it normal. Feel safe if it's normal. My observation of myself and of other people is that experiences which contradict the inbuilt norms of conditioning are not just puzzling, but are truly frightening and can precipitate states of sickness or even mental instability. So it would seem, if trauma is to be avoided, and a degree of psychological and physical equilibrium is retained, then people need a degree of detachment from their conditioning, which may, of course, be brought about by good luck, extensive experience, predisposing personality factors, a matter of luck, maybe, I would think. If one has this sort of luck, and you have extended parameters, then you have a better chance of retaining your conditioning, your composure, during and after the close encounter. The evidence in child rearing would suggest that teaching an open-ended approach to reality is likely to produce adolescents and adults who can respond to unusual experiences without losing their composure or the suspension of their critical faculty. And from what all the channels are saying, they are the people who will survive the next few years. Things will not be normal, no matter how much we would like them to be so. Another important concept is the concept of role. To become a victim is to accept the role of victim. To accept the role that the other person imposes upon one. And one accepts that in the case of child victims, which Hopkins documents, the subservient role is brought about by force majeure. In cases of adult contact, however, without the use of physical restraint, it is presumably open to contactees or abductees to negotiate or renegotiate the role that they are prepared to play. And there is evidence in the literature that individuals have resisted victimization and entered relationships with entities on their own terms, however strange this may seem. There's quite a remarkable case which happened at a place called Bebeduro, which is my translation, it's my pronunciation, it's somewhere in Brazil, in which a fisherman who was abducted adopted an equality role with his abductors. He was fishing, taken away for several days by a group of small entities, long hair, red hair, beards. And they put to him the proposition that he should collect data for them on Earth, and then eventually, some years later, would be their guide on a future expedition. His refusal to do so irritated them intensely. And while they were quarrelling among themselves, Jose, that's his name, was given support in his refusal by a human, saintly figure who appeared suddenly on the scene, superimposed on what was happening to him, or superimposed on what he thought was happening to him. And apparently the little abductors were oblivious of the presence of this entity, this apparition, this angel. Jose took heart from what this apparition said to him, so much so that the aliens gave up hope of persuading him and brought him back to Earth. Despite suffering from some shock on his return and some doubts about his ability to continue to resist their blandishments, he wanted to meet them again to see if he had been right to reject their overtures in the first place, which is hardly the attitude of a victim, more of an equal. So, providence, if I can use that outdated term, in some guise or other, often intervenes. Another significant concept is the concept of personal growth. And this has a central place in humanistic psychology, and several influential contactees, abductees, call them what you will, such as Geller, Strieber, Meyer, suggest that alien contact of this kind offers the opportunity to develop as a personality towards an enlarged concept of the self, or enhanced motivation, or a changed concept of human destiny. And with Geller in the phrase in the quotation I used above uses the word purification, which is a similar thing. It seems to me then that if one is to have any hope at all of making positive sense of these several decades of UFO contact, there has to be an initial openness to the idea that we are not alone in the cosmos, but if an individual, for whatever reason, has been narrowly conditioned to exclude this idea from conscious consideration, then fear, rejection, panic, terror may be the inevitable reaction. Let me summarise now, if I may. There seem to be a number of factors important in determining the emotional outcome for the individual from a UFO abduction or contact of a close kind. Number one, it's quite clear that the actual experience itself may be similar to a nightmare or to a pleasant dream. And whether it's a nightmare or a dream depends on a number of factors. It depends on the perceived malevolence or otherwise of the abductors, the nature of the demands that they're making upon one, the scenario that they are putting before one, the future that they depict for one, if one complies or does not comply. All these are important. In other words, the content of the abduction will determine to some extent what the emotional outcome will be. And then secondly, the presence or absence of warnings, support, or if you like, providential interventions. This is also important. Whether these be in the form of men in black, angels, advisors, it's quite clear from the evidence that these have to be heeded. There's no place for foolhardiness or egotistical intransigence. Your back is against the wall, and you need all the help you can get, seems to be the point. And this attitude will determine whether long-term harm or composure can be expected. And then thirdly, there is the personality or the maturity of the contactee himself or herself. There's little that's been scientifically proven here, so far as these experiences are concerned, but as I've said, if conditioning, role identity, and reality orientation are in a certain configuration, then the individual may be relaxed and enjoy the experience, as many reports show they can. Fourthly, the presence of peer support or group formation arising from the experience, as when cults are formed. There are many thousands of such cults now. These cause individuals or help individuals to positively, to look at the positive aspects of contact or abduction, and often to advance psychologically or spiritually as a result. And fifthly, if the content of the contact, the knowledge that the individual gains, for example, is positive, then the individual may come to positively value what has happened to her or him. And this, of course, is the case for many of the devotees, the Damskis, the Mengas, and so on. This is not to be mocked, in my view, from a psychological point of view. Well, what do we want? We want people going around with neuroses and psychoses induced by contact, or do we want positively oriented people? I think the world would be better with more of the latter. The alternative, to me, seems to be repression, amnesia, and trauma, and the pain that's associated with those for the individuals concerned. Thank you.
Who would like to be the first question? Albert.
I wondered if you at all have linked up this amnesia that's products of post-encounter products with the sort of amnesia that you get on waking when you forget your dreams. I wonder if you made that correlation at all. I mean, if you haven't, obviously, got to just know, we'll leave it at that. But would you have any comments on that?
Yes, I think not a lot, as far as I know, has been done on why it is we forget our dreams. But if I can hazard a theory, you see, all the time, within the individual, there's a battle between the ego and the higher self. That's the way, one way of looking at it. The ego is materialistic, it is very well conditioned to physical reality, and it usually has some good ideas for getting along. Within the individual, there are forces pushing the ego towards development or growth. And this growth comes in the unconscious via dreams. It's not in the ego's interest very often to allow too many dreams to enter into consciousness, to awareness rather, and to be pondered upon and generally taken heed of. So there's an element of repression goes on even in the amnesia associated with forgetting
I
dreams.
think that sort of amnesia is the kind of amnesia that takes place as opposed to having in mind that the encounter experience is internal and not like a waking dream. And just as the processes of forgetting our dream, just as a matter of course, whatever the reason is that we do that, you put that to one side, but I'm trying to draw a parallel between the forgetting of dreams and the forgetting of encounters.
Oh yeah, well,
internal experiences.
well, forgetting is a very important psychological. We must remember that forgetting is a very important psychological fact. And there's no doubt about it. You know, that there's whole loads of things that we forget. And why why this happens is itself a big thesis. And I think it's mainly I think to do with the status quo. The ego's involvement and identification with the status quo, and that can be disturbed by dreams, UFO contacts, religious experiences, NDEs, you know, all sorts of things, OBEs, and
NBEs. CBEs. I mean, gentlemen here in the front.
Do you think that abductees need therapy? If so, what kind?
well, I mean, the answer to that is that some abductees clearly do. The problem is those abductees we don't even know about because of the repression has been so thorough. So nothing is remembered. As to those who are in great trauma, as in the case of the Hill couple and so on, I would have thought that the bringing material to light, as their hypnotherapist did, and generally, I would say, widening the frame of reference of the individual to take account of the unusual. I mean, how do most people live their lives? Can I be so bold as to suggest a lot of people live their lives, work 9 to 5 if you're lucky, and down to a pint at the pub? I mean, that dead treadmill is shattered, or potentially shattered by the things we're talking about.
Gentleman here at the front.
You used the mayor, the Lightyear's case a few times in the Gallo as well. Well, because the Lightyear's like been proved at hoaxes anyway. Are you aware of that?
They've all been proved to be hoaxes.
Well, no.
That's all a hoax. The whole thing is a hoax.
Well, yeah, but how can you can't use it as an example? How can you, I can't see where you can use that as an example. You're not getting
I'm talking psychologically about an individual who was not fazed by his contact. In fact, is enlarged, becomes a guru. Now, whether he is misleading the people that he's guru-fying with, I don't know. But he's got to be an example of the kind of person who is positively enhanced in his adjustment and adaptation as a result of these contacts. Now, in the case of Maya, anyway, he was on the spiritual quest from his youth. He did the Himalayas thing, didn't he? The Far East. And so he was always looking for answers. And whatever it was he got, and nobody very clear at all what it is he did get, it's clearly not knocked him over. It has enhanced him, strengthened him. So psychologically, he is not a problem.
One last question. There was a gentleman up here at the back. It's
I'd like to know a question to you. I have a double condition called narcolepsy and catalepsy.
So can you speak up, please, sir? I can't hear you.
So I have a double condition called narcolepsy and catalepsy. So over a long time. Having read a lot of things, I must say along with what was saying, there's something actually wrong with their processes. However, when you are presented with film which is taken through military aircraft and this type of thing, and you're saying that that is also psychologically, we're making that up, it doesn't exist.
You're talking about pieces of film, are you saying that these are physical evidence or of a psychological nature and don't exist?
See, through this condition that I have, I know that the brain plays some very funny tricks. And you have to sort these things out.
Well, I must apologise because I can't hear your question properly, but I do understand you're talking about the reality status of UFO experiences, whether they're physically real. Now, I tend to share the view of those writers that think that what we're talking about here are paraphysical phenomena. In other words, they are borderline phenomena between the mental and the physical. I'll give you an example. Two people are driving along in a car and the driver says to the passenger, "We're being followed by a UFO," and the passenger looks behind and says, "No, you're not, it's a bus." And the driver then goes on to stop and has contact and converse with the members of the UFO, and his friend says, "Why is he speaking to those people on the bus? What's he doing?" Now, getting on board a UFO is not the same as boarding a 747 at Heathrow. We're not talking about the same thing. We don't understand the human mind. There's only, in fact, one mind in the universe. And we occupy a little segment of it and call it my mind. But in fact, there's only one mind. Now, what that mind is capable of far exceeds what is to be found in textbooks of psychology or textbooks of logic for that. So I agree with you entirely that we're dealing with one of the great things about the UFO experience is that it is forcing us to look at these anomalies associated with the mind and come to grips with them at a very late stage in development.
Once again, John Shaw, thank you very much. As part of John's presentation, he mentioned that he